Hey everyone, welcome to session 119 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. You know, providing feedback to staff members is essential for delivering quality services, but doing it effectively is easier said than done. And that's why I'm so excited to share this conversation I had with Dr. Natalie Parks from behaviorleader.com. Natalie, along with co-authors Adam Ventura, Erica Crowley, and Dennis Uriarte, just published Feedback F-Ups and How to Avoid Them. And in session 119, we really dive deep into this topic. Natalie describes some best practices for providing feedback, including how to do so in the current digital meeting age we find ourselves in. We also talk about how to provide feedback to the quote-unquote difficult staff member, as well as how to incorporate the feedback process in staff onboarding procedures. If you find this topic interesting, I suggest heading over to behaviorleader.com and click on the Featured Products button and order a copy for yourself. There's also a 5-day Fix Your Feedback Challenge on their website as well, which sounds like a lot of fun. If you find this episode helpful and would like to get a supervision CEU for it, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs. Once there, you'll find CEUs on a variety of different topics, including this one, as well as discounts for bulk purchases. Lastly, I'd like to mention that, for the last few years, I've been running the Behavioral Observations membership program. It's kind of like a do-it-yourself Patreon. It costs, about $9 a month, or as I like to say, the cost of a mediocre martini. And members get access to a private Facebook group in which they're able to get nearly instantaneous access to the videos of these podcast interviews, often weeks or months before they are published. The best part is that members get the raw conversation itself. That means there's no ads and none of the introductory comments. And sometimes we leave the bloopers, retakes, and do-overs in, so you really do get the raw feed. Another cool thing about the membership program is that we hold Zoom hangouts with former guests. We do this about 6 times a year, although we've been doing it a little bit more frequently as of late. And the way it works is this. We schedule a Zoom call, and the guest comes on to join us, and the members get an opportunity to ask them questions directly. It's a lot of fun. So if that's something you're interested in, go to behavioralobservations.com/membership. All right, so that's it for introductory comments. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun and informative conversation with Dr. Natalie Parks.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Natalie Parks, thank you for joining me on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to get to talk with you.
Oh, same here. I know you and your colleagues just published a new book, Feedback F-Ups. And I want to get into that. It's Feedback F-Ups and How to Avoid Them. And so it's a good time to talk about all things, providing supervision and feedback and things along those lines. So I'm very much looking forward to, exploring the lessons that you guys wrote about in that book. And going into other types of fun supervisory rabbit holes and things like that. But before we get there, I'd like to ask you a little bit about how you got into ABA in the first place. What made you, how'd you find out about it? How'd you, kind of contact it? And what made you want to pursue it as a career?
It's kind of an interesting story. And I have to say that I kind of fell into ABA. I think as many people kind of my ABA generation did. I was pre-med undergrad, a biology major, was considering going to business school if I didn't go to medical school. About maybe a month before graduation, I threw out all of my med school applications and decided I wasn't going to do that and decided I was going to do something fun with my life. Took a job teaching preschool, and for extra money, I was offered to work a couple hours a day after school with an individual with autism in his home. So that was my first introduction. I didn't get a whole lot of training. I was kind of thrown to the wolves, so to speak. But the science of behavior made a lot of sense to me. It fit, I think, really well with my biology and very scientific background. And I worked with a couple kids for a few years, got a really awesome, great mentor that told me he would only write a letter of recommendation if I applied to the school he was at, which was Mizzou, and ultimately where I ended up for the rest of my training.
Okay, so for folks who aren't familiar with the nickname, what is Mizzou?
Oh, yeah, sorry about that. All the non-regional people. It's the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri.
Got it. Thank you. So the science appealed to you. Was there a particular moment of behavior change with an individual that you were working with that kind of clicked for you, or was it just a general process that you found appealing?
So I think part of it was the general process, just that it was systematic, that we were collecting data, that we were making decisions based on the data. I really enjoyed that part. The first individual that I worked with also had fairly severe problem behavior. So the stories that stand out to me most are the ones where maybe problem behavior was at its worst. My first session alone with him, I actually still have the scar on my leg from where he bit me. And I think it intrigued me to know that I could be part of making a difference in this child's life, and in terms of teaching him alternate ways to behave, teaching him more socially acceptable, more, adaptive behaviors, that type of thing. The cool thing about him is that I actually stayed with him all throughout graduate school. So I got to see him kind of go from being a 5-year-old child with a lot of problematic behavior to being a junior high student who hadn't engaged in any problematic behavior for over 3 years. And so that story is something I still carry with me in those moments that I'm evaluating my career, feeling burned out or that type of thing. I remember kind of just how powerful our science is. And I think that's really what got me hooked.
Yeah, it makes that, I'm just guessing here, but perhaps that scar is kind of worthwhile, right? I've got quite a few myself from those early days. So, especially when you can achieve an outcome such as you've described here. So bring us up to speed to what you're doing today.
So now I actually focus much more on the organizational behavior side of things. I transitioned away from the clinical world, but still work very much in the clinical practice, just from an OBM standpoint. And our most recent book, Feedback F-Ups and How to Avoid Them, was written with a focus on two things. One, clearly the focus on feedback and all the things people do to mess it up, so to speak, all of the errors that they provide, all of the things that they overlook. And hopefully we've provided a formula that people can consider and use it to make sure that their feedback actually affects performance in the way that they want it to. But the second thing that we are attempting to do is disseminate behavior analysis outside of the behavior analytic field. So our book is written with hopefully a fun tone. Clearly the title is Feedback F-Up, so there's some fun in that.
A little tongue in cheek,
hopefully. Yeah. And we wrote it for all leaders and managers who are working to improve the performance of a follower or more. So that's kind of where our focus was. It's an add-on. We wrote a leadership book that is leadership and behavior analysis. Adam Ventura and I, along with our other co-author, Ashley Tudor. And so this kind of dives into maybe one of the specific topics in that book that was covered.
So I want to get into the book, but one thought just occurred to me that I thought would be a fun area to explore is, what was the transition like from your clinical work to your OBM work? Because I know that's a transition that some people kind of accidentally find themselves in. we develop these clinical skills in our training and things like that, but we're not always taught how to lead, how to manage, how to supervise. So if you can kind of describe your transition from, was it a deliberate process? Was it kind of just the accidental course of your career arc? Perhaps if you could describe some learning challenges you might have had in terms of, if you were one of those people who struggle with that transition. So, if you can dive into that for a minute, that would be great.
Yeah. So I think all of the above, a little of it was deliberate. A little of it was reflecting on my career and the pitfalls and challenges I had throughout. I moved into leadership positions as a young professional. And I think like many of us, and part of the reason that the driving force behind what I do today was, I was like, all right, I'm a leader. So what does that mean? I'm really good at these technical skills. I'm really good at working with kids and changing behavior in individuals. But changing the behavior of adults, of professionals is a little bit different. And I didn't get any formal training in that. I made a lot of mistakes. I can look back and say like, man, if I knew now what then I maybe could have avoided some hardships for myself and others.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I was promoted to a management position very early on in my career, and I was, kind of promoted to my level of incompetence. Frankly, looking back at perhaps some curious decisions and things like that. So I could totally resonate there with you.
Yeah. I think I was promoted beyond my level of incompetence, so to speak. But I think I learned and I did some things really well. And, I continued to struggle with other things for a long time in my career. But the one kind of common theme that came out that I didn't really realize until a few years ago, and I actually had one of my supervisors point it out, and I wasn't quite ready to receive it when he did point it out. But I have a long history of kind of going out and starting things and getting them kind of organizationally sound. And once they are running, I am on to the next thing. And so when it comes to kind of like starting organizations or change management, redeveloping organizations, that seemed to be my sweet spot. But the long-term kind of maintenance of here's an organization that is running well and they just need a strong leader to continue that was where I kept finding myself in those positions, but I wasn't awesome at it. I wanted to like keep moving on. I was like, I got this. This is done. Like, let's do something different.
Yeah. And so you can think of those. I'm sorry, but as you're saying this, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it sounds like those are just two entirely different repertoires with two different sources of reinforcement, of course.
Yes, huge differences in reinforcement. And one of the reinforcing kind of activities for me, or one of the biggest reinforcers, is having different and new and challenging things to do. And so when positions or job tasks are not challenging, I tend to, there's no reinforcement for me. And I tend to, you see my behavior change as a result. I don't do as good of a job. So I kind of made that jump to go out on my own and really focus on OBM, because I thought that's where I could make the biggest impact, as well as access the best reinforcers to keep my behavior going steadily.
So working as I assume this means that you were doing some consulting independently. Is that what you're?
Yes, I started doing some consulting independently. And I actually, because I was still working for an ABA company, I did have a discussion with my leaders there. And I practiced outside of the behavior analytic field. So my initial kind of clients or consultation projects were on small businesses that had nothing to do with behavior analysis. So I had like I had a marketing person who was starting her own marketing business. I actually had a musician who was starting a business to she was trying to increase the marketability of independent musicians and create kind of an organization for collaboration and networking. So I had some really kind of fun and interesting experiences working outside of the behavior analytic field, but still applying the principles. And then I made that jump almost completely. I discontinued my employment and went out completely on my own. Made a leap of faith, and it was a big leap. I fell for a while before I caught myself. But, you know, I wanted the ability to also work with people in our field and kind of give back to behavior analysts as well.
What were, you know, I'm sensing there might be perhaps some lessons for dissemination here, particularly as you sought out agencies or organizations to work with outside of behavior analysis. Can you share any tips for people who might be in a similar boat? And, you know, it sounds like you contacted some novel, occupations, if you will, occupational categories. So what were some ways in which you were able to connect with these entities and essentially sell behavior analysis to them?
Yeah, so I actually joined a lot of networking organizations. So I was still in Los Angeles at the time. I'm now back in Missouri. But there was a National Association of Women Business Owners. I joined that, and they had networking events. So it was kind of just geared towards around providing women who own businesses an avenue to get support from one another, lots of learning opportunities, that type of thing. I joined and I became a very active participant. So I went to all of their things. I signed up to be on committees. They eventually invited me to come speak on certain topics. So I would talk to them about how behavior analysis or behavior strategies could help organize business, help and motivate and sustain work of employees, all of those types of things that we traditionally talk about in OBM. The one thing that I would say that I think allowed me to enter these fields is that I didn't use a lot of behavior jargon. So I presented myself as, I am Natalie Parks, another individual who is trying to be successful just like you. And this is my expertise area. These are the things that I know about. As opposed to, I'm a behavior analyst and I'm here to help you with your organization and fix your employees and that type of thing. So I think, and I talk to people now a lot who want to work outside of the behavior analytic field. And the number one thing I tell them is like, you know, all that emotional intelligence and those soft skills and being personable, that we as behavior analysts get a little irritated when people throw those terms at us. Like, let's define those, let's operationalize them, and let's master them, because that's what gets you in the other fields.
Great. I think that's a worthwhile detour on our plans to chat today, because I think those are great lessons. Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing is that you didn't go in there and get on the whiteboard and draw the 2x2 grid distinguishing positive and negative reinforcement in type 1 and type 2 punishment, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Look at behavior analysis. This is awesome, and you will use it. Yeah.
Right. I think I did enough of that in IEP meetings, and that behavior was severely punished. So I learned the non-examples of what to do when you want to play well with others in the sandbox, so to speak.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. I appreciate the humility, and I'm sure that attitude certainly served you well. So, all right. So, feedback F-ups and how to avoid them. So, what was the what was the problem you guys were trying to solve when you were writing this book? What was the motivation for writing it? Who is the perhaps intended audience? Of course, we've talked about that a little bit already, but if you can kind of speak to those questions, that would be great.
Yeah, and I can't take full credit for the initial idea. The initial idea and thought about creating some sort of formula that people could follow to improve their feedback effectiveness came from Adam and Erica, which are two of the co-authors. They originally kind of had this idea of, could we create a mathematical formula? And I think that speaks to our behavior analytic minds very well. And in my work with Adam on the leadership and behavior analysis stuff, we began talking about feedback and the holes in the literature about really what makes feedback effective. So there's a lot of literature out there about feedback. Some of it is contrary to what science would tell us. And much of it doesn't really truly focus on the variables that increase or decrease kind of behavior. And we know as behavior analysts, there are specific things, whether it's, immediacy of reinforcement or, having consequences when rule-governed behavior doesn't follow through, making sure that it becomes contingency-based, things like that. That the rest of the world doesn't really know, right? We as behavior analysts know, we're really good at it. But the outside world, they talk about things like feedback sandwiches, and they talk about things about, maybe provide more positives than negative feedback, but they don't tell you what's important about positive feedback. Telling everybody that they're awesome all day long doesn't really actually change performance. It might make people feel good initially, but the long-term consequences of that don't really translate. So we wanted to write something that was fun, that appealed to leaders of all kinds, but also solve the problem of scientifically, what is it that we can or should stay away from to actually use feedback as a performance improvement tool.
Got it. And so in the book, you talked about outlining several variables that go into providing feedback. You've touched on some of them already, but what would you see as, and if you want, I'm not going to ask you to list all 10 of them unless you'd prefer to do that. And certainly we don't want you to kind of read the book to the audience. That would not make for good podcast listening, I don't think, despite how engaging the book might be. But
right.
So let's talk about some of those variables. What are some of those variables, and what would you see as some of the more important ones, and why?
Yeah, so, that's a good question. And I definitely, there are 10 variables that we outlined, and then we actually went into, and here are some follow-up things to consider. So, but, it's interesting because there's certain things for behavior analysts that we kind of take for granted, like be specific and make sure it's about a behavior and not some, abstract quality. That non-behavior analysts largely don't account for. So when I'm speaking to non-behavior analysts, I focus on things like be behaviorally specific, make sure you're objective, make sure you have some data. When I'm talking to behavior analysts, I focus on some things that maybe we traditionally don't think as much about, including like how and where you're providing the feedback. So what does your environment look like? We've all walked into, that maybe in grad school, that old professor's office that's got like papers and books everywhere, and it has that funny smell to it. And it's really kind of dingy. And you walk in and you're so focused on the environment, you have no clue what your professor is talking about. So considering things like that, like, what's going on in the physical environment? Am I giving feedback face to face in person, or am I doing it through email? And what things do I need to consider? tone, a voice is missing from written words. So the person is left to put their own tone on it, which doesn't always work in your favor, especially when giving like some sort of corrective feedback. A lot of times people can insert a different tone or a different cadence of speech and interpret the message differently than how you intended it. So we focus a lot on those things. And I know like right now, that's actually where I'm spending a lot of my time talking, because we've all transitioned to a new normal of communication with one another, right? We're not face to face very often anymore, if at all. And so that's one of the areas that I think is one of the most important, is understanding that language is more than just the words that we're saying or we're writing or typing, and how to account for that language or the language gap when I'm not face to face with somebody, when they can't hear my voice, see my facial expressions, read my body language, those types of things.
I see. Yeah. And I think that, as you mentioned, these days we're all kind of doing the Zoom lifestyle, or the whatever the online portal of choice that is. What are some strategies that supervisors can use in these new settings, virtual settings, if you will, to maximize the effectiveness of feedback and minimize the likelihood of misunderstanding and all the other things that go along with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there are pros and cons to being virtual, right? The clear con of now everybody working through Zoom and from their home when they used to be in an office is that our kind of spontaneous interactions are no more, right? Like I can't just log into Zoom and be like, hey, who's here today? I can't walk by anybody's office anymore. I have to plan that out. And so the interactions become a little more formal. We start thinking about, why are we having this meeting right now, as opposed to me just stopping by your office and checking in and saying, how are things going? What's been the best thing about your week? Things like that. So I think first, finding ways to fill those gaps. A lot of people have found some sort of instant messaging that they like, and that helps increase the communication between people. And I would say, as a leader, reaching out to your team and checking in and providing behavior-specific positive feedback. So if you heard that they did something right, pass that on to them. If you if they sent you an email or completed a work task on deadline, provide them that feedback, be specific about it and send that. I think when it comes to corrective feedback, the advice or the rule of thumb has always been do it in person as much as possible. So I would say do it through Zoom, because that's our new in-person, or Google Chats or whatever teleconference interface you're using, but allow that person to hear your voice and see your facial expressions whenever possible. That way you can clarify if there are misunderstandings immediately. You're not like left to waiting for an email response and then they're waiting for another email response. That just totally decreases the effectiveness. If you can't, have that in-person or virtual meeting, and you do have to rely on just written word, I always say err on the side of caution and be a little bit more formal with it. Don't be sarcastic. Don't lace it with jokes to try and lessen the blow or anything like that. And then be as specific as possible. So provide contextual cues. Maybe that's where like our ABC descriptive data comes in, describe exactly what happens, exactly what the behavior was that, whether it's a behavior that you want to change or a behavior you want to continue, and then the results of that behavior. So like, what impact did it have? I think both with corrective and positive feedback, knowing the impact of I did something and it had this great impact for the organization or the clients that I'm working with is really good to know. It provides an extra level of reinforcement for the individual receiving it, but it also kind of connects the dots, right? Especially for that corrective. So like I missed a deadline, so what? It feels a lot of times deadlines feel like these arbitrary things our leaders put on us because they just want to. But saying like, well, I ask you to turn it in on this date because we have to submit the import to insurance by this date, and I have to revise it or blah blah blah. That helps drive behavior a little bit better.
Yeah, definitely tying it into, no, we don't get these things in, we don't get paid. And,
Right.
That's definitely can definitely be a powerful message. So you've talked about positive and negative, or corrective and positive feedback, I guess. And so I think this is a good opportunity to bring up the feedback sandwich again. And this is a term that I learned way back in the day as a grad student reading one of Aubrey Daniels' books. And in our email correspondence leading up to this interview, you said that you've encountered a lot of behavior analysts who aren't familiar with this term, which is I guess surprising to me. And so let's take this opportunity to kind of clear that up a little bit. So what is a feedback sandwich? Why is it bad? And what should people do as an alternative?
Yeah. So feedback sandwiches are essentially where you're taking two positives as if they are the two pieces of bread, and you're sandwiching the meat, which is the correction, in between them. So if you came to a feedback session with me and I was going to feed you this sandwich, I would say, hey, Matt, it's really great to see you. I just love working with you. You're such an awesome guy. By the way, you really screwed up, and here's how you screwed up. And usually what happens is people get really detailed about it. And, and then they'll say, so stop screwing up, but, keep that smile on your face because your blue shirt is awesome with your eyes. See you later. So it's sandwiching kind of the meat and the reason that you're providing feedback in that moment between these two positives. And the theory behind it, or a lot of people teach it, and it's actually widely taught in a lot of business schools and in HR trainings as a way to kind of lessen the blow. The problem with it, besides all of the research tells us it's ineffective, but the reason it's ineffective is kind of multi-layered. One, the positives are usually these arbitrary, they don't have much to do with anything, they're not behaviorally specific. So they seem disingenuine. It seems like people are just throwing it in so that you don't think they're an awful person. And so they discount it. They don't really think you mean it. And that undermines kind of any positive feedback that you might give outside of the feedback sandwich. The other problem is that usually the correction is not an actual correction. It's just negative. It's just like, stop doing that. Go be better. And the person's left with like, well, I would love to be better, but I don't actually know how to do that. I thought what I was doing was correct. And now you've told me it's wrong, but you haven't given me the way to fix it. So kind of all of those things paired together, usually people are left with kind of feeling like, so I just screwed up big time and I'm not sure what to do about that, but I'm going to go try and be better. And it just undermines everything that you're really trying to do. So the better way to do it is to always be specific, always tie it to objective behaviors, and to only give positive feedback when you mean it, and give corrections and not just negatives. So if something is an error, tie it, as I said before, tie it to why, tie it to the outcome, and then provide the training, whether it's training or instructions or practice that's necessary so the person can actually be successful.
So let's pretend like I'm an RBT and I'm not doing my session notes or something like that, and or I'm not completing the data sheets properly and whatnot. And you've called me into a virtual meeting. So what would be the preferred way of providing feedback?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Put me on the spot a little bit in terms of I'm going to provide you some feedback, Matt. So, I think first I would say, let's have a meeting to review your data collection and session notes. And that way the person knows what it's about. Hopefully I've already built a strong relationship with you. So you're not getting that email thinking like, Natalie's called me into her office and now I'm in trouble.
It's like going to the principal's office.
Right. So, there's kind of some initial things in terms of relationship development. Hopefully this is just like a regular meeting. We do this periodically to review it. But you come in and, I greet you, we start the meeting, and then I would probably pull out the data and say, I want to spend some time going through this with you and talk through kind of what happened. And then, let's say the scenario is that you didn't collect data for certain programs and that you didn't include what reinforcers you use in session notes. And those are expectations we have. I would go through that and I would say, I see that, there are no data recorded for the manding and the tacting program. Can you tell me a little bit about that? So I'd gather some information, find out from your perspective before I make those conclusions, what happened. I'm going to assume you're going to say, things got really crazy and I didn't quite remember. So I just didn't write anything down. And I would say, I get, sometimes sessions can get a little crazy and it can be difficult to record that data. However, we record data and I would go into why. We want to make sure that we know how many trials are being presented so that we know kind of how quickly our kiddo is learning. We also want to make sure that even if you can't recall accurately, that you make some sort of note so that we know if problem behavior was happening or what exactly made the session so crazy so that we can plan for it. Me as the BCBA in charge of the program, I need to know these things so that I can make the sessions or help make the sessions run more smoothly so that I can come and maybe observe and overlap with you and we can problem solve together. But if you don't record those things, I won't know. And so we can't problem solve. And then with the session notes, the reason we record the reinforcers is so that the next person knows what was used to help decrease satiation. So the kid's not just getting the same two things over and over again all day. And then I would ask, do you have any questions? Would you like to watch a video together and practice taking data? And how can I better support you as we move forward?
Okay. Yeah. So obviously the elements that you've described earlier, that it's specific, there's a rationale tied to it. It's not personal. It's not like you're there's no characterological, assumptions being made on the individual's behalf. So, one thing I want to talk about is that if that was me, and I would likely take that feedback seriously and want to improve that aspect of my therapeutic repertoire. But as I think anyone listening to this podcast knows, there are these folks that we work with at times that might have skill sets that are different, and they may be awesome in certain areas, but we've all worked with staff, I think, who are just very, very difficult. They take feedback poorly. They can be somewhat argumentative or combative, and the like. Just speaking to my own experience and also my own just observations in general, sometimes we avoid those people or avoid providing feedback to those people because it's aversive for us. So we're stuck in this kind of this loop of poor performance that we have a hard time correcting because of these behavioral dynamics. So talk about how you coach people to support staff who are, again, I hate to use this broad term, are difficult, or take feedback poorly. That's not super well defined, but I think you get what I'm talking about. So how do we support these staff and help them improve their performance?
Yeah,
Or help them find a different occupation.
Right, find a new occupation. Go to a different company. No, and I think it's that's it's a common question and a common problem. I think all of us have probably come across at least one person who does not accept feedback as we would like them to.
Yeah, we all want people to say, "Oh, of course, Natalie. I'll totally, I'll get right on that."
I've never had that problem. Everybody is totally gracious with me, but no, I have had probably
I'm so sorry.
Every story under the book, from people threatening to hit me all the way to crying, and everything in between. So, I think one of the things is, speaking to the relationship that you have with the person. And I think, again, that's something that maybe we as behavior analysts, I know that Pat Fryman talks a lot about that, kind of a new way of looking at behavior analysis and how to build relationships a little bit more effectively. But the relationship you have with the person speaks volumes to how well they're going to receive the feedback from you. And sometimes what I say to people is it that this individual doesn't receive feedback well, or is it that they don't receive feedback from you well? And that's a different question, right? Is this a skill deficit problem, or is this a relationship and reinforcement problem? So I try to kind of first identify that. And if I have an individual that is just generally not very receptive to feedback across the board from multiple people, I treat that more as a kind of learning situation. And I try to look at it as, receiving feedback is difficult for all of us. Nobody likes to be told that they're doing something wrong, or they hurt somebody, or, did something that resulted in a negative outcome. And being able to receive that and then change your behavior in some sort of way as a result of that is a skill. And we have to learn that. And so if somebody's not doing that, I put my behavior analytic hat on and say, like, okay, so how do I teach this skill? Maybe I need to introduce it as just that, and have a conversation about, it's really difficult to receive feedback. Here are kind of the things that I expect to happen when you receive feedback, and I would like to practice those. And I would probably do some role plays of some arbitrary situations. I'd probably start with like positive feedback, because it's been my experience that those who don't receive corrective feedback well also don't receive positive feedback well, but we don't notice it as much.
Really?
Yeah, usually you have there are individuals who are, they receive positive feedback and they might say something that undermines it, like, "Oh, I'm really not that great. I'm just doing my job." And we take those things to be like, oh, they're gracious, or they're humble. But if it's always consistently that statement, I would argue that there are times that everybody does something that's pretty awesome, and they should be able to say, "Hey, yeah, that was kind of awesome." And so, but a lot of times positive feedback makes people feel a little uncomfortable as well. And so I usually start there. How does it feel for you when I tell you that you do things really well? Is that uncomfortable? Do you not like it? Would you rather me focus on the corrective? Most of us have those learning histories that kind of tell you like you're not getting better unless you're getting corrected. So I kind of focus there, but then I really dive into, let's talk through what happens when you get corrected. And I think that's where, I'm not an expert in, acceptance and commitment therapy or anything like that. But I think when we're working with adults, diving in a little bit into what are the stories you're telling yourself right now? What is that negative self-talk or, self-talk that's occurring? And how are those behaviors mediating the observable behaviors that I'm seeing? And do we need to kind of unpack that a little bit? And then I kind of say like, we're going to do a role play. This has nothing to do with you. But I want you to practice the behaviors that I would like to see. So I would like to see you nod your head. I would like to see you ask me a question about what it is that I'm telling you. I would like you to see you demonstrate what I ask you to demonstrate. And a lot of times when you take it out of the context of I'm giving you feedback about your performance and we're just role playing, people can practice the skills without all of those additional emotions and kind of covert behaviors that are happening. And then, I give them positive feedback about like, yep, that was perfect. Excellent question. Way to go. I like how we role played that, and we just keep practicing. And then we move back to, now I'm going to give you some feedback about what you're actually doing. And I go really heavy on the positive reinforcement of the behaviors that we've been practicing that I want to see.
I see. So yeah, it's, sounds like it would be a good thing to roll into perhaps a staff member's onboarding training. Receiving feedback is something that is just a normal course of action in this agency or this organization. And we have challenging kids to support, or individuals, learners, whatever, to support. Everyone, including myself, we're all going to make mistakes at times, and we need to be mindful about how we identify and correct these mistakes for the betterment of the people we serve. I can imagine that being, perhaps having that be part of the training. So there's an expectation that this is just normal, and corrective feedback will be a part of the experience as an employee, because that's really, it's probably foreign to many people's work histories if they're coming in from a different setting.
Yeah, I love that idea. And I think not only does it kind of introduce, here's our expectation, this is the way we do things around here, but it can also kind of on the front end immediately negate whatever negative feelings or thoughts that you have about what feedback might look like, that we all kind of carry with us from our early experiences. And if it's in a training, you could even make it fun that, kind of pairs feedback with some positive reinforcement, which, I love that idea. And then it focuses on like, these are the skills we want you to demonstrate when your time comes, because everybody's time is going to come.
Yeah. It'd be fun if we put together some sort of montage of non-examples from like Michael Scott from The Office or something like that.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And we try to dive into that. Like we'll highlight, here's another feedback F up in the book, and, maybe role playing some of those, like how bad can we make this go right now?
Yeah. Yeah. That'd be fun. Excuse me. Are there other kind of do's and don'ts or other aspects of the 10 variables that you talk about in the book that you feel would be noteworthy for this conversation?
Well, I mean, clearly I think everything that we talked about is pretty noteworthy. I think we've touched on the main kind of meat of things pretty well. The only thing that I would add that I think is kind of a fun chapter is we do talk about generational differences.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Tell.
Yeah.
Because I am in the I'm in Generation X, so I am an older BCBA by most objective measurable standards. So many of the folks, when I feel like a dinosaur at times when I go to a conference. So
I can relate. I'm technically an Xennial. I'm in that micro generation.
Okay.
But which I always try to rationalize as the best of both worlds. But
yeah, I think Matt Broadhead calls that the analog childhood, digital adulthood, or something like that.
Yeah, that's kind of like we made the transition with the rest of the world. But we kind of dive into those kind of globalized response class of behaviors of each generation, so to speak. And then dive into kind of how might a manager or a leader respond differently based on who they're working with. I'm not going to give you the punchline because you'll have to read the book to find out how you're
totally
supposed to respond. But it's a fun chapter. And I think our conclusion is not necessarily the expected one that most people would think about when you start talking about generational differences.
Yeah, I think it's a worthwhile endeavor to dive into that because I think the typical way of framing this challenge is that there's an older supervisor trying to deal with these darn millennials, But I know this has happened to me when I had less gray hair, is that I found myself many times supervising someone who was older than me.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of almost like a military situation where you have the young officer and like the older non-commissioned officers or whatever, and they've been there and done that. And here I am, a few years out of grad school, trying to manage and lead in these kind of challenging circumstances. And I know that's been a challenge for me, obviously very much less so these days. But I know there are a lot of my BCBA colleagues who do find themselves in those situations where they're working with an RBT or a paraprofessional who is their parents' age or something like that, and that presents its own set of challenges. So I look forward to learning more about that in the book. So let me ask you this: I know we have a few minutes left here. What I always end the interview with, what advice would you have for newly minted BCBA? And I would like to get your thoughts on that, of course. And at the same time, would you have advice for a BCBA who's doing clinical work now, but has that itch, that drive to look at things from a more organizational perspective? And how might they start making that transition, especially since you kind of walk that path yourself? So you can take those questions in any direction you like, but I thought that would be a fun way to kind of wrap up our chat here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for newly minted BCBAs, one of the things, and as I've talked to people who have been in the field for a long time, we work in a field that is fun and that is encouraging and has a lot of built-in reinforcers, but it can equally be stressful and we can reach burnout quickly. And so one of the things that I've held with me through my career and I revisit very often is, what are the reinforcers that keep me going? Whether that's kind of in task preferences or what population I'm working with, differences, that type of thing. Always continue to learn. I think that's one way to access and identify additional reinforcers for yourself, is to learn, whether it's learning more about the treatments of the individuals you're working with, what research is out there that you're unaware of that you can incorporate into what you're doing. Get a good network of support, people that you can trust, that you can share your stressors with, who will encourage you and keep you going. I think that's, having people throughout your career that will always kind of encourage you and keep you motivated is really important. And for those of you looking to move kind of from the more traditional clinical world to OBM or whatever else, I have my hands in a lot of things right now. So I have sports and OBM, and I actually work with schools with their general education teachers. So not even in special education as well. And the one thing that I would say is, first, find a mentor, find somebody who's doing it that you can talk to. And I think it's surprising to a lot of younger BCBAs, but really all it takes most of the time is an email at the right time. And I'm going to put that at the right time, because we, as the kind of more experienced, busy BCBAs, we might get an email and have the best intentions of responding to it. And 3 weeks went by and we still haven't responded. So don't let that discourage you, or don't take that to mean that we're not interested or we don't want to have that conversation with you. Most of us, I would say, in my experience of people I've reached out to kind of cold, hey, I'm a random person and I think you're awesome and I'd like to talk to you about that awesomeness. Most people respond very positively to that. So, take that leap and just reach out to people and ask them for advice or for mentorship or that type of thing. And then get to know the language of the field that you want to go into. So, we as behavior analysts have our own language, and it truly is our own language. And I can't stress enough how important it is to speak the language of the people that you want to work with. And so if you want to go into sports, learn some sports jargon. If you want to go into education, learn some education jargon. If you want to go into business, learn some business jargon. And that will help you be able to talk to the people who you will be working with.
Very good. If people want to learn more about you or the various books that you guys have published at behaviorleader.com, would that be the best place for folks to get started?
Yeah, that's the best place to get started. We actually, I just put up like a featured products button, so you can find everything that we're doing pretty easily. And you can also actually send me an email from that website as well if you'd like to talk more just with me personally.
Great. Very good. Now, this has been a fun conversation, a very timely one. And I appreciate you coming on the podcast to share your thoughts. So having said all that, Dr. Natalie Parks, thanks for joining me today.
Yes, thank you, Matt. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.